Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, January 25th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Minnesota and a new ruling from Minnesota's High Court, their Supreme Court, that now invalidates what the state legislative Republicans decided to do in a very interesting past couple of weeks. Now, the Minnesota state legislative elections took place at the same time as the presidential election, and with it came a very competitive chamber. The Minnesota House of Representatives ultimately ended up with equal amounts of Democrats and Republicans, 67 to 67. It was a bit of a change what we saw in 2022 when Democrats were able to win that majority, 70 to 64. It was an advantage the Democrats were holding over the Republican Party's head until, of course, an election in which it ultimately ends up with a tie. Now, unlike many other state legislatures, the House of Representatives is not necessarily broken by who is the incumbent governor, which means because Tim Walz is currently governor of the state, it really has no impact on what's happening here in the House of Representatives. So then ultimately it comes down to a power sharing agreement. We remember this, a lot of the conversations around it on the national level. Now, obviously, Vice President Harris broke that tie in the 50-50 after the 2020 election. Now we're starting to see that in the event of a tied vote, just as it is described in the Constitution, Vice President Vance will also break that tie. But again, specific to Minnesota, this is about two parties working together and coming up with an agreement. Now, Democrats have been in that advantage in Minnesota for quite some time, and they used it very excessively, might I say. Not to say that's positive or negative, but Democrats did, in fact, pass a number of key legislative points that have been seen as very progressive and very much in the leftward direction. The Minnesota House Democrats locked rank. They didn't lose any of their members. And ultimately what we saw in the 2024 election was, although they did lose 3 individual seats, many of these Democrats are loyal to the party and will not shift from party vote. Everything seemed to be fine. Republicans and Democrats were working together on this power sharing agreement, and this is really where the big problem starts. What we found was that ultimately one Democrat ended up not being in a position where he could be seated. What happened was somebody ran in a House district that they did not live in, and by Minnesota Constitution could not serve out that district. So this person had gotten through the Board of Elections, gotten through the candidacy point, gotten through the primary, won a general election, and was ruled ineligible. Thus, the vacancy opened up. Republicans, in theory, took a plurality majority, which sounds like an oxymoron, but essentially what I'm trying to say here is they had 67 seats, which is not a majority by quorum, meaning not a majority of total number of seats, 134 in the state legislature. They had 67, Democrats had 66, and there was one open vacancy. So then the Republicans dropped the power sharing agreement. They said, we're not going to work with the Democrats on this because we don't need to. We have the advantage, and thus we are going to elect a speaker and continue as normal. So the Minnesota Democrats say, we're going to walk out. But the Republicans say, it doesn't matter. We have the advantage, so we're going to elect a speaker. But then the Democratic Secretary of State steps in and says, wait a second, there's no quorum. Take a look at this chamber. You only have enough to reach the halfway point. Quorum is 50 plus 1, meaning that you're at a point where you have over half the chamber present. Democrats did not send a single one of their members to the state legislature. Again, talk about, locking rank on the Democratic side. Not a single Democratic House member decided to go to the Minnesota State House. So why does that matter? Well, it blocked the Republican Party's technical quorum. But the Republican Party proceeded anyway, so they elected a speaker. They chose a Republican and said, the Democrats are doing theatrics, it doesn't matter, we have the majority right now, we are going to elect a speaker, and then Democrats were going to have their hands tied because in this reality, if Republicans did in fact get through, they would have had a speaker, but they wouldn't have enough votes to remove said speaker. They would need majority, so 50 plus 1 to remove the speaker. They had a tied chamber, so they were never going to get it. The Republicans do this, they took advantage of it. Democrats went to the state Secretary of State. The Secretary of State says that it's not quorum. Republicans say you don't have the authority to that. So Democrats sue even further. They get all the way up the court chambers to reach the Supreme Court of Minnesota. They strike it down and say that quorum is defined as half plus 1 of the majority of the members, not the majority of, seat numbers with vacancies. Essentially here, they said you need 68. And because not a single Democrat showed up, and not a single Democrat is showing up until that special election seemingly is taking place, the speaker elections will not happen. The speaker elections can't happen. And the Democratic Party is preventing the Republican Party from seating their own speaker. So all of this is happening. You might be wondering, why is this so important? Well, one, governing in a state is very important for Democrats. They have a governor. They have a power-sharing agreement with a tied Senate. They know how to work in this state. And if Republicans were going to take advantage of it, they were going to push back. Combined with the fact that Minnesota is a state that voted for Vice President Harris. It has a Democratic governor, recently had a Democratic trifecta, and 2 Democratic senators. Minnesota, by nature, is not a Republican state. On top of that, in the vein of being a state that voted for Kamala Harris, they also have become the states that have joined forces with many other Democratic states to battle against Trump. What does this exactly mean? Suing Donald Trump for executive orders that they find unconstitutional. Making decisions surrounding immigration policy and Donald Trump's national overview and saying we are either going to say yes to this or say no to this. Either way, they have an opinion on something and are going to interact with the Trump administration either positively or negatively. Chances are it's negatively. Looking around here, what the Democratic Party has sort of set up in Minnesota and in many other states is that they are going to selectively go along with what they think is okay from the Trump admin, and so far, it isn't so much. That comes in general view. Then you take a look at what the Republicans are trying to do in the state. If there wasn't discontent for Donald Trump and the Republican Party before, there absolutely is more now. Again, reminding us of where we were right after the election, both parties knew in the chamber that they would have a tied 50-50, 67-67, whatever you want to say here. They knew it would be tied, wrote up the power sharing agreement, and Republicans just completely threw it out. They elected a speaker, thought this speaker would be here, had to be vacated on the 14th, and the Minnesota Supreme Court upholding that decision. Now, some Republicans are hoping that this can get further to higher courts, national courts. I don't imagine that it will, but ultimately, though, where we are right now is that by definition, the Republican Party did not meet the quorum standard that the Democratic Party believes that they needed to meet. And as a result, there's now this whole constitutional crisis taking place in this state where neither party is able to pass any legislation. Neither party is working in the way that they historically have. And looking at the state of Minnesota in specific, we have not seen this type of walkout strategy in the state since the 1850s. A very long time ago, Minnesota was the last time we saw Democrats really focused and hone in on something like this, and not even just Democrats. I mean, across the country, we've seen it happen, but in Minnesota specific, it has not happened in a very long time. So, Democrats are clearly playing a game that might be different than what they have played in years before. It very much seems like they are willing to go toe-to-toe with the Republican Party in states like Minnesota, and we might be seeing that Donald Trump's second admin, in a way that maybe the first one didn't, is igniting Democrats to take an approach to politics that feels very different than in years past. I'm not saying this has any type of major electoral implications. I don't think that we should be extrapolating, the early days of either the Trump admin or, a Minnesota state legislative session. But I think, again, it speaks to the conversations we've been having about the post-Trump election Democratic Party, about what their party looks like. How do Democrats foresee the future? Do they fight fire with fire? Do they gerrymander where Democrats need to gerrymander or Republicans need to gerrymander, right? When you look at those states, when you look at a state like Florida, do Democrats take a look at that and say, we are going to go ahead and, crack down in another state? Obviously, it's all dirty politics. And obviously, from an objective standpoint, probably bad for democracy. But when it comes down to what we've been seeing so far, it looks like there is a new approach, at least to some degree, to electoral politics the Democrats are now exhibiting. And now they're twisting around, all of these different things, not in a negative way or a positive way. I use twisting as a very general sense. The spin room is a thing that Democrats and Republicans both partake in. They are doing a lot of heavy lifting to paint the Republicans out to be the enemies in this situation in Minnesota, and very well they may be, right? Democrats might be. This is a situation where the courts will decide, and they seemingly have sided with the Democratic Party, but we will see how much further Republicans want to take it. But I've been very interested in maneuvering, seeing the maneuvering that the Democratic Party in Minnesota has been doing. Not only now, but in years past, the past 2 years, they've been doing a lot, doing a lot of things that they determine to be progress on the Democratic side, related to free lunches, related to, overall infrastructure in the state. Democrats had a huge, set of legislative wins over the past 2 years. They're not going to let Republicans stop it now. And so I will be interested to see, if there is any Supreme Court, decision from the National Supreme Court on this circumstance, if there's going to even be a higher court that would take an issue like this one, because it's very often that these are localized issues, that these justices know their state Supreme Court, state constitutions and precedents and mandates far better than the national courts do, but, never turn away from the national courts injecting itself into something that it might not be appropriately able to do so. But looking specific to Minnesota, it doesn't look too bad for Democrats, but it does look like it's going to be a tied chamber regardless. And so power sharing will be a question. Power sharing will be in the point of conversation. But I really am looking at this from trying to be at least truly objective about it, and it very much seems like the Democratic Party in Minnesota and potentially largely around the country, while there may not be as much of an appetite for resistance, while, with Donald Trump winning the national popular vote, there is not as much pushback on the incumbent president as there was in 2017, when the argument was the majority of the country didn't vote for you, and now it's the majority of the country didn't vote for you because you won by a plurality rather than, you didn't win the popular vote, Hillary Clinton did. It's a very different set of circumstances, right? And I think Democrats are realizing that. Regardless, though, there is still pushes out there to prevent the Republican Party from having their own legislative wins, from having their own types of victories. And it all starts local. So Minnesota, 2026, Tim Walz is likely to run for governor again. It seems like that's likely. He is able to run for governor again. It looks like there might be a 2022 or 2018 type of election. Now, if you want to see the difference in these, we can go back in time to 2018 when Democrats had 75 to 59. So that was a pretty substantive election. Obviously, when you're taking a look at 2016 when Republicans had the advantage of 77 to 57, must have felt, much worse for Democrats after 2016 compared to now. 2020, it narrowed down 70 to 64. It gets there again in 2022. Now it gets even closer. I'm interested to see what happens in 2026. And like I said, I'm not here to extrapolate, what's happening in the state house right now, but I do think it could speak to a Republican Party that might end up facing far more obstruction from the Democratic Party, especially after this. I imagine the power sharing agreement prior to this speaker debacle looked a lot better for the Minnesota GOP than it does now. I imagine Democrats are going to leverage the fact that the Republican Party used this against them, right? I think they're going to look at this and say, you know what? If they're saying it from the we standpoint, we, the Democrats, see the Republican Party as a threat to acknowledging quorum, X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we are going to do, 1, 2, and 3 to retaliate. I could see it happening. I really, really could. And that might have electoral repercussions, because Minnesota is a state that is competitive. I mean, don't get me wrong. When we look back at 2024, while, we did have Tim Walz on the ticket, we did have Trump at 47% of the vote in Minnesota, right? Harris at 51%. It's actually less than what Biden had in 2020. If you remember, he won by 7.1%. 2016, though, Clinton only won by 1.5%, but granted, right? Kamala Harris had her running mate for Minnesota. Now, if you're comparing Virginia compared to 2024, you can see Virginia really did, in fact, improve for Harris, and she didn't have Tim Kaine on the ticket, senator from Virginia, the running mate to Hillary Clinton. But I will still say, Minnesota is a competitive state. It will have a competitive governor's race. And even with Tim Walz on that ballot, even with Tim Walz on the ticket, Minnesota still ended up being less than what it was for Walz in 2022. If we remember looking back at the governor elections in 2022, what did they tell us? That Minnesota went to Tim Walz by 7.7% against Scott Jensen, I believe, Scott Jensen. It's a competitive race this upcoming cycle, and maybe, and now this is the maybe part, maybe what's happening now between Democrats and Republicans will, in fact, have an impact on the 2026 Minnesota House of Representatives elections, Minnesota State Senate elections, Minnesota gubernatorial elections, Minnesota congressional elections. But again, this might be the start of what we've been starting to see across the country of mainstream Democratic parties really ramping it up in their negotiation, in their offensive against the Donald Trump GOP that we know today, because it is much more Donald Trump's GOP today than it was in 2016, than it was in 2020. And I think there is now a brewing appetite on the Democratic side to utilize the power they have now and take advantage of that and exercise court power the same way Republicans do nationally and build out this broad strokes, Democratic, grouping of chambers, right? House, Senate, courts, governor's mansion, all these different things, and using that to their advantage to continue to hold legislative and election wins over the Republican Party. And this is an example of that. And you can read far more about the nitty-gritty about what's happening here in the Minnesota State House. Very fascinating. Quite past few weeks. All in all, though, very interesting stuff is happening in American politics, even if it is early days of the second Trump admin and early days of Minnesota's legislative session. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 post-election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.